The afternoon sun hung like a brass coin over Millfield, casting long shadows across the dusty Main Street. The air shimmered with heat that seemed to press down on everything. The weathered storefronts, the hitching posts, the few souls brave enough to venture outside. From Murphy's saloon came the occasional thud of a door swinging shut and the low murmur of men seeking refuge in whiskey and shade. Mary Whitfield stood beside the general store's wooden steps, her brown hair escaping its pins despite her best efforts to keep it neat. Her dress, once blue calico, had faded to the color of winter sky, and the hem bore testament to too many walks down dusty roads. At 24, she carried herself with a straightness that spoke of pride, though her eyes held shadows that suggested that pride had cost her dearly. The horse trader, Jake Morrison, leaned against his wagon with the easy confidence of a man who'd never known want. His bay mare stood patient in the traces, her coat gleaming despite the dust. Morrison's voice carried across the street as he called out to anyone within earshot. "Fine animal here, strong back, good teeth, gentle enough for a lady, but spirited enough for real work." A small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, old Pete from the blacksmith shop, and a few ranch hands who'd ridden in for supplies. They examined the mare with the practiced eyes of people who knew horseflesh, running hands along her legs, checking her hooves. That's when Morrison's gaze fell on Mary, and his smile took on a different quality entirely. "Tell you what," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll throw in something extra sweet with this here mare. Package deal, you might say." Heat crept up Mary's neck, but she kept her chin level. She'd heard worse, much worse. "Horse and rider together," Morrison continued, his laugh harsh in the still air. "Both of 'em well broke to saddle, if you catch my meaning." The crowd's murmur shifted, some uncomfortable, others snickering. Mary felt their eyes on her like brands. She could walk away, should walk away, but her feet seemed rooted to the sun-baked earth. A rider approached from the north road, dust rising behind his horse's hooves. He was a stranger to Mary, though she caught Pete nodding in recognition. The man sat his saddle like he'd been born there, his brown hat pulled low against the glare. His clothes were simple: dark pants, cotton shirt, leather vest, but clean and well mended. When he dismounted, his movement spoke of careful strength. "Afternoon," he said, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the hot air. "Heard you've got a horse for sale." Morrison's chest puffed out. "Samuel Reed. Thought that was you riding in?" "Yes, sir. Finest mare in 3 counties. Strong as an ox, pretty as a picture." Samuel, for that's who he was, walked slowly around the bay, his hands gentle as he examined her. The mare nickered softly, already trusting him. Mary found herself watching those hands, noting how they moved with certainty, but never harshness. "She's a good animal," Samuel said finally. "What's your price?" $40, Morrison replied quickly. "But like I was saying, special deal today. 45 gets you the horse and—" He gestured toward Mary with a theatrical flourish. The words rose in Mary's throat before she could stop them. Perhaps it was the heat, or the way Morrison's eyes stripped her bare, or simply the weight of too many years carrying whispers and stares. "I'm not a virgin," she said, her voice cutting through the afternoon like a knife through canvas. The street fell silent. Even the cicadas seemed to pause their singing. "Mrs." Henderson's hand flew to her throat. Pete looked at his boots. The ranch hands exchanged glances that ranged from shocked to amused. Morrison's laugh was the first sound to break the silence. "Well, there's honesty for you. Saves a man the trouble of finding out later." But Samuel Reed didn't laugh. He turned from the horse to look at Mary directly, his gray eyes steady under the brim of his hat. There was no shock in his expression, no judgment, just a quiet attention that made her feel seen rather than exposed. "How much for just the horse?" Samuel asked, his gaze still on Mary even as he addressed Morrison. "Told you, $40. But the deal, just the horse." Morrison's smile faltered. Now hold on. Reed, special offer here. You're getting on in years. Living out there all alone. Man needs companionship. $40, Samuel repeated, and something in his tone made Morrison step back. Mary felt the crowd's attention like a physical weight. Some faces showed disgust, others curiosity. A few held the calculating look of men measuring opportunity. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, meeting their stares with what dignity she had left. "Course, if you change your mind about the package deal," Morrison said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. "I'm sure we could work something out. The ladies had experience, if you know what I mean. Might even be grateful for a roof over her head." Samuel's hand moved to his vest, and Mary caught the glint of metal. Not a gun, but something that made Morrison's smile disappear entirely. "The horse," Samuel said again, and this time his voice carried winter in it despite the blazing heat. $40, yes or no? Morrison looked around the crowd, perhaps seeking support, but found only averted eyes. Even his admirers seemed to have lost interest in his particular brand of humor. "Fine," he muttered, holding out his hand. "40 it is." Samuel counted out the money with the same careful deliberation he'd shown examining the mare. As the coins passed from hand to hand, Mary felt something shift in the air around her, as if Morrison's hold on the moment had been broken. "Pleasure doing business," Morrison said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He gathered his reins and climbed onto his wagon seat. "You change your mind about that other offer. Reed, you know where to find me." As the wagon rolled away, the crowd began to disperse. Mrs. Henderson hurried back to her boarding house with obvious relief. Pete returned to his forge, and the ranch hands wandered toward the saloon, already spinning the afternoon's events into a story they'd tell over whiskey. Soon only Mary and Samuel remained beside the general store, the bay mare standing patient between them. The sun seemed to press down harder now, and Mary could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the shade. Samuel looked at her again, that same steady regard that neither demanded nor judged. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. "You got anywhere to go?" The simple question hit her harder than Morrison's crude suggestions. She thought of the tiny room above Chen's laundry where she'd been staying, paid for by taking in mending and the occasional kindness of women who remembered what it was like to be young and alone. She thought of the whispers that followed her down every street, the way conversations stopped when she approached. "I manage," she said. Samuel nodded as if he'd expected that answer. He gathered the mare's reins and looked toward the road that led out of town. "I've got a ranch about 10 miles north," he said. "Could use help with cooking, mending, other work too, if you're willing. Pays fair. And there's a room in the house." Mary stared at him. "You don't know anything about me?" "Know enough. The things they say." "I didn't ask what they say." The words hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she dared cross. In the distance, she could hear Morrison's wagon creaking down the main street, and she knew that by evening. Every person in Millfield would know what had happened outside the general store. They'd know what she'd said, and they'd make their own assumptions about what it meant. But this man, this Samuel Reed, stood before her offering something she'd almost forgotten existed. A choice that wasn't about her past, but about what came next. "Why?" she asked. Samuel adjusted his hat against the sun. "Man gets tired of talking to horses all the time," he said. And though his tone was serious, she caught something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Mary looked down the street toward the boarding house, then back at Samuel. The bay mare stamped once, eager to be moving. "I'll need to get my things," she said. "I'll wait." Mary's belongings fit into a single carpet bag that had seen better days. A spare dress, some undergarments, a brush with half its bristles missing, and a small Bible her mother had given her before the fever took her. Not much to show for 24 years of living, but it was hers. When she returned to the street, Samuel was checking the mare's harness with the methodical care of a man who understood that details mattered. He looked up as her footsteps approached on the wooden boardwalk. "Ready?" he asked. Mary nodded, clutching her bag's worn handle. The weight of it seemed heavier now, as if it carried not just her possessions but the decision she'd just made. Samuel gestured toward his wagon, a sturdy affair with weathered sides and wheels that had rolled over countless miles of frontier roads. The bay mare stood hitched alongside his own horse, a steady-looking chestnut gelding with kind eyes. "May I?" Samuel reached for her bag. She hesitated for just a moment before handing it over. He placed it carefully in the wagon bed, treating her meager belongings with the same respect he might show fine china. The street wasn't empty. Mrs. Henderson had found reasons to sweep her front porch, and Tom Bradley lounged against the post office wall, whittling a piece of wood with exaggerated concentration. Even old Pete had emerged from his forge, hammer in hand as if he'd been interrupted mid-strike. They were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Samuel moved to help Mary up onto the wagon seat, offering his hand palm up. His fingers were calloused from rope and leather, warm and steady. As she stepped up, she felt the eyes of the watchers like pinpricks along her spine. "Let 'em look," Samuel said quietly, as if he'd read her thoughts. He settled beside her on the seat, gathering the reins with easy familiarity. But before he could signal the horses forward, a new voice cut through the afternoon air. "Well, I'll be damned." Jake Morrison's wagon had returned, rolling back down Main Street with a rumble of wheels and harness leather. The horse trader wore a grin that showed too many teeth. "Samuel Reed," Morrison called out, pulling his wagon alongside theirs. "Looks like you reconsidered my offer after all." A few of the watchers stepped closer, drawn by the promise of more entertainment. Mrs. Henderson's sweeping grew noticeably quieter. "Changed your mind about that package deal, did you?" Morrison continued, his voice carrying easily across the street. "Can't say I blame you. Gets lonely out there on that ranch of yours." Samuel's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins, but his voice remained level. "Just heading home." Sure, Morrison laughed. "With your new help." He emphasized the last word with a wink that made Mary's skin crawl. "Though I gotta say, Reed, you could have saved yourself some trouble. I was willing to make the price real reasonable for both." "The lady's coming to work," Samuel interrupted, his tone carrying a warning that even Morrison couldn't miss. But the horse trader was too pleased with his own wit to heed it. "Work, that's one word for it." He slapped his knee and looked around at the growing crowd. "Though I reckon she's got plenty of experience in that particular line of—" Samuel stood up on the wagon seat. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that Morrison's words died mid-sentence. Samuel wasn't a large man, but there was something in the way he carried himself that made him seem to fill more space than his frame should allow. "Mr. Morrison," Samuel said, and his voice was quiet as winter wind through bare branches. "I believe you've said enough." Morrison's face flushed red, but whether from embarrassment or anger, Mary couldn't tell. "Now see here, Reed, I'm just making conversation. No call to get your dander up." "I'm asking politely," Samuel continued, settling back onto the seat but keeping his eyes fixed on Morrison. "Let us pass." The street had gone quiet again, that peculiar frontier silence that often preceded trouble. Mary felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was her fault. Her words outside the general store had started this, and now Samuel Reed, a man she barely knew, was defending her against a situation she'd created. Morrison looked around at the watching faces, perhaps seeking support, but found only neutral expressions. In a town like Millfield, folks were careful about choosing sides, especially when they didn't know all the players. "Hell," Morrison muttered finally. "No need to get all bent out of shape. Can't blame a man for having a sense of humor." "Move your wagon," Samuel said. For a moment, Mary thought Morrison might refuse. His hands gripped his own reins tight enough that his knuckles showed white, and she could see him weighing his options. But Samuel waited with the patience of a man who'd faced down rattlesnakes and weather and the 100 other challenges that frontier life could throw at someone. Morrison clicked his tongue at his horses and pulled aside, but not without a parting shot. "You watch yourself out there. Reed, some things ain't what they seem." Samuel didn't respond. Instead, he signaled to his own team, and the wagon lurched into motion. As they rolled past Morrison, Mary caught sight of the horse trader's face. The earlier amusement had curdled into something uglier, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that this encounter wasn't over. But then they were past him and moving down Main Street, leaving the watchers and whisperers behind. Mary sat straight on the wagon seat, acutely aware of the man beside her. He'd stood up for her, actually stood up for her, against Morrison's crude implications. When was the last time anyone had done that? "Thank you," she said quietly. Samuel glanced at her, then back at the road ahead. "No need." They passed the last buildings of Millfield, the church with its modest steeple, the schoolhouse where children's voices carried through open windows, the small cemetery where wooden crosses marked the graves of those who'd tried to make lives in this harsh country. Soon there was nothing but prairie stretching in all directions, broken by occasional stands of cottonwood or the distant line of bluffs that marked where the land began its slow climb toward the mountains. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. Mary realized it was different from the oppressive quiet that had followed her confession in town. This felt more like the natural pause between people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. The wagon wheels found their rhythm on the rutted road, and the horses settled into an easy pace. Mary found herself studying Samuel from the corner of her eye. His hands on the reins were sure but gentle, and he sat relaxed despite the confrontation they'd just left behind. There was something solid about him, like bedrock beneath topsoil. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked finally. 5 years come fall," he replied. "Built most of it myself." "Must get lonely." Samuel considered this for a long moment. "Quiet, mostly different things." Mary nodded, understanding the distinction. She'd known plenty of loneliness in her time, the kind that ate at you from the inside, that made you desperate for any human connection even when you knew it would cost you. But quiet. Quiet was something else entirely. Quiet was peaceful. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Cattle, mostly. Some horses. Garden patch for vegetables." Samuel paused. "Cooking, mending, general household tasks. Nothing improper," he added, and Mary caught the careful way he said it. Heat crept up her neck again. Of course he'd feel the need to clarify that. After what Morrison had implied, after her own words back in town, any reasonable person would assume the worst. "I can cook," she said, "and I'm handy with needle and thread." "That's good." They lapsed into silence again, but Mary's mind wouldn't quiet. Questions churned through her thoughts like dust devils across the prairie. Why had he really offered her this position? What did he expect in return? And perhaps most troubling of all, what would happen when he learned the full truth about her past? Because Morrison wasn't entirely wrong, much as she hated to admit it. She wasn't the innocent farm girl her appearance might suggest. There had been men, not many, but enough to fuel the gossip that followed her like smoke. There had been choices made from desperation, and mistakes that couldn't be undone. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon when Samuel spoke again. "Ranch is still another hour or so," he said. "We'll need to water the horses at Miller's Creek up ahead." Mary nodded, grateful for something concrete to focus on. In the distance, she could see a line of green that marked where water ran through the otherwise brown landscape. As they approached the creek, Samuel pulled the wagon into the shade of a massive cottonwood. The horses nickered softly, smelling water, and he unhitched them with practiced efficiency. Mary climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from sitting, and watched as he led the animals to drink. "You can stretch your legs if you want," he said. "We'll be here a few minutes." Mary walked to the creek's edge, grateful for the cool air that rose from the water. She knelt and cupped some in her hands, splashing it on her face and neck. The dust of the road washed away, and for a moment she felt almost clean. When she looked up, Samuel was watching her with that same steady attention he'd shown in town. But there was something different in his expression now, something that might have been understanding. "Whatever brought you to Millfield," he said quietly, "it's behind you now." Mary stared at him. "You don't know what you're saying." "Maybe not," Samuel agreed. "But I know what I see." "And what's that?" He gathered the horse's lead ropes, preparing to hitch them back to the wagon. "Someone who deserves a fair chance." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind, because they suggested possibilities she'd stopped allowing herself to imagine. "I never asked you to be," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. Mary looked at him sharply. "What?" "Back in town, you said you weren't a virgin." Samuel's voice was matter-of-fact, without judgment. "I never asked you to be." He finished hitching the horses and helped her back onto the wagon seat. As they pulled away from the creek, Mary found herself fighting back tears she couldn't quite explain. They weren't tears of sadness, exactly, or even relief. They were something more complicated, the kind of tears that came when you realized you'd been holding your breath for so long you'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. The road stretched ahead of them, leading toward whatever future waited at Samuel Reed's ranch. Mary sat straighter on the wagon seat and watched the sun paint the prairie gold as it began its journey toward night. The road from Miller's Creek stretched ahead like a ribbon of packed earth, winding through grassland that rolled away toward the horizon in gentle swells. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and the air carried the sweet scent of prairie grass warming in the late afternoon heat. Mary found herself stealing glances at Samuel as the wagon rolled along. His profile was sharp against the golden light, strong jaw, straight nose, eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. His hands on the reins were steady, competent, and she noticed how the horses responded to his touch with trust rather than fear. There was something about his silence that intrigued her. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of someone who didn't know what to say, nor the deliberate withholding of a man keeping secrets. It was simply peaceful, as if he was comfortable enough in his own skin that he didn't need to fill every moment with words. "Been ranching long?" she asked, partly to break the silence and partly because she genuinely wanted to know. "Most of my life," Samuel replied. "Started working cattle when I was 12. Had my own spread for 5 years now." "Always in this territory?" "Born in Missouri. Came west after the war." He paused, and Mary caught something in his expression that suggested those weren't easy memories. Seemed like a good time for a fresh start. Mary nodded, understanding that sentiment all too well. The war had left its mark on everyone, one way or another. For some it was physical wounds. For others it was the kind of damage that couldn't be seen but ran just as deep. "What about you?" Samuel asked. "You from Millfield originally?" "Kansas," Mary said. "Little farming town called Cedar Rapids. My parents had a homestead there." "Had?" "Fever took them 3 years ago, both of them within a week of each other." The words came easier than she'd expected. Perhaps it was the rhythm of the wagon wheels, or the fact that Samuel's attention felt genuine rather than merely curious. "Lost the farm not long after? Couldn't work it alone, and the bank." She shrugged. "Well, banks don't much care about sob stories." Samuel made a sound that might have been sympathy or understanding or both. "That how you ended up in Millfield?" Mary hesitated. This was where the story got complicated, where the simple tragedy of orphaned farm girl became something messier and harder to explain. But there was something about Samuel's steady presence beside her that made honesty feel possible. "Not directly," she said carefully. There was a man, Thomas Hartwell. He said he'd help me keep the farm, said he had connections at the bank. She could feel heat creeping up her neck at the memory. Turned out his help came with expectations. Samuel's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins, but he didn't speak. When I made it clear that wasn't the kind of arrangement I wanted. He made sure the bank foreclosed anyway. Then he spread word around town that I'd been willing, but had tried to take advantage of his kindness. Mary's voice grew bitter. Amazing how fast a story like that travels, and how much it grows in the telling. So you left. Had to. Couldn't find work, couldn't rent a room. Every door that opened when I knocked closed again the minute they heard my name. Mary stared out at the endless grass, remembering those desperate weeks. Millfield was just the first place I found where nobody knew the story yet. But they made up their own. Mary glanced at him sharply, surprised by his perception. How did you? Small towns are the same everywhere, Samuel said quietly. Young woman alone, no family, no husband. Folks'll fill in the blanks themselves, and they usually don't fill them in kindly. The truth of that statement hit her harder than she'd expected. She'd thought she was running from Thomas Hartwell's lies, but she'd really just been running toward new ones. Different people, same judgments, same assumptions about what a woman like her must have done to end up alone. That why you said what you did today? Samuel asked. In town. Mary felt her cheeks burn. I suppose I got tired of people thinking they knew my story. Figured if they were going to judge me anyway, at least they'd be judging the truth. And is it the truth? The question hung between them like smoke from a distant fire. Mary found herself studying Samuel's profile again, looking for some sign of what he wanted to hear, but his expression remained neutral, simply waiting for whatever answer she chose to give. Does it matter? She asked finally. Samuel considered this for a long moment. Not to me, he said, but it might to you. They rode in silence for a while after that, the wagon wheels finding their rhythm on the packed earth. Mary found herself thinking about truth, how slippery it could be, how the same set of facts could be arranged to tell completely different stories depending on who was doing the telling. The truth was that she wasn't a virgin, though not for the reasons people assumed. There had been a boy back in Cedar Rapids, before her parents died. Jimmy Morrison, no relation to the horse trader, thank God, who'd courted her properly and talked about marriage and made promises under the summer stars that he genuinely meant at the time. She'd given herself to him thinking they had a future together, only to learn that his parents had other plans and bigger ambitions for their son than a poor farmer's daughter. The truth was that after her parents' death, when Thomas Hartwell had offered his help, she'd been desperate enough to consider his terms, not desperate enough to accept them, but desperate enough to understand how a woman could find herself making choices that others would judge without understanding the circumstances that led to them. The truth was complicated, messy, human, and she was tired of trying to explain it to people who'd already made up their minds. There, Samuel said, pointing ahead. Mary followed his gaze and saw buildings emerging from the prairie like islands rising from a golden sea. A house, a barn, several smaller outbuildings, all weathered but well-maintained. Cattle dotted the nearby pastures, and she could see horses in a fenced corral near the barn. It's not much, Samuel said, and Mary caught something that might have been self-consciousness in his voice. It looks peaceful, she said, and meant it. As they drew closer, Mary could see the care that had gone into the place. The house was simple, single story, built of solid logs with a wide front porch, but the windows were clean and the yard was free of the debris that often accumulated around frontier homes. The barn looked sturdy, its roof recently patched, and the fencing was straight and well mended. You built all this yourself? She asked. Most of it. Had some help with the barn raising, but the rest, Samuel shrugged. Took me the better part of 3 years. Mary could imagine him working in all weather, laying each log with the same careful attention he'd shown examining the horse back in town. There was something satisfying about the thought. A man creating something solid and lasting with his own hands. They pulled into the yard as the sun touched the western horizon, painting everything in warm, golden light. Samuel unhitched the horses with practiced efficiency, while Mary climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long ride. "I'll show you the house," Samuel said, gathering her carpet bag from the wagon bed. "Get you settled before it's full dark." The front door opened directly into the main room, kitchen, dining area, and sitting space all combined in the efficient way of frontier homes. The furniture was simple but well made, and Mary noticed small touches that spoke of a man living alone, but trying to maintain some comfort. A colorful quilt thrown over the back of a chair, books lined up neatly on a shelf, a coffee pot sitting ready on the stove. "Your room's through here," Samuel said, leading her to a door off the main room. The bedroom was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out toward the eastern pastures. Someone, Samuel, she realized, had made an effort to make it welcoming. The quilt on the bed was freshly laundered, and there were wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. "I'll leave you to get settled," Samuel said, setting her bag on the chest. "There's water in the pitcher there, and I'll have some supper ready shortly." Mary nodded, suddenly feeling awkward. Now that they were here, in his house, the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was alone with a man she barely knew, miles from anywhere, dependent on his goodwill for shelter and food and safety. Samuel seemed to sense her unease. "Mary," he said quietly. She looked up at him. "You're safe here," he said simply. "I want you to know that." The words were spoken without dramatics or grand gestures, but something in his tone convinced her he meant them. She nodded, not trusting her voice. After he left, Mary sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the small room. It was the first space she'd been able to call her own in longer than she cared to remember. No landlady hovering with suspicious eyes. No fellow boarders whispering in the hallways. No sense that she was one missed payment away from finding herself back on the street. Through the window, she could see Samuel moving around the yard, tending to the horses with the same quiet competence he'd shown all day. As she watched, he paused to scratch behind the ears of a barn cat that had appeared from somewhere, and she caught a glimpse of gentleness that made something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could stop running. The sun disappeared behind the western hills, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. From the kitchen came the sounds of Samuel preparing supper, and Mary realized she was hungry for the first time in days. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her spare dress in the small wardrobe and arranging her brush and Bible on the chest of drawers. When she emerged from the bedroom, Samuel was ladling stew into 2 bowls at the kitchen table. The smell made her mouth water, beef and vegetables and something that might have been wild herbs. "Smells wonderful," she said. "Rabbit, mostly," Samuel replied. "Shot it this morning. There's bread too, though I can't vouch for the quality. Baking's not my strongest skill." Mary took a bite and found the stew surprisingly good, better than she'd expected from a bachelor's cooking. The bread was dense but edible, and after days of subsisting on whatever scraps she could afford in town, it tasted like a feast. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. When they finished, Mary started to gather the dishes, but Samuel waved her away. "Tomorrow's soon enough to start earning your keep," he said. "Tonight you're a guest." Mary settled back in her chair, cradling a cup of coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead but somehow exactly what she needed. Through the window, she could see stars beginning to populate the vast prairie sky, more stars than she'd ever seen from town. "It's beautiful here," she said. Samuel followed her gaze. "Gets lonely sometimes, but yes, it's beautiful." "Is that why you offered me work?" The loneliness? Samuel was quiet for so long that Mary thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Partly, he admitted. But mostly because you looked like someone who needed a fair chance, and I happen to have one to give. Mary stared into her coffee cup, feeling that strange tightness in her chest again. You don't know anything about me. Not really. No, you've got backbone. Samuel said, no, you speak your mind even when it costs you. No, you're not afraid of hard work. He paused. No, you've been judged for things that aren't anybody's business but your own. And that's enough? Samuel met her eyes across the table. It's a start. Outside, a coyote called to the night, its voice wild and lonesome. But inside the warm circle of lamplight, Mary felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility of belonging somewhere. Thank you, she said quietly. Samuel nodded and rose to bank the fire in the stove. Better get some rest. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you properly situated. As Mary made her way to her room, she paused in the doorway and looked back. Samuel was standing by the window, looking out at his land with the satisfaction of a man who'd built something worth keeping. For the first time since her parents died, Mary dared to hope that she might be worth keeping too. Mary woke to the sound of rain drumming against the window glass. For a moment, she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the steady rhythm and trying to remember where she was. Then it all came back. The confrontation in town, the wagon ride, Samuel's quiet kindness, and the small room that was, for now at least, hers. Gray light filtered through the curtains, suggesting dawn was still some time away. She could hear movement in the kitchen, the soft clink of metal against metal, the whisper of bare feet on wooden floors. Samuel was already up, likely preparing for whatever work the day would bring. Mary dressed quickly in the dim light, smoothing her hair as best she could without proper light to see by. When she emerged from her room, she found Samuel standing by the stove, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. Morning, he said quietly. Didn't mean to wake you. The rain did that, Mary replied. Sounds like it's coming down hard. Samuel nodded toward the window. Been at it since about 3. Doesn't look like it's planning to let up anytime soon. Mary moved to the window and peered out into the gray morning. Rain fell in sheets across the yard, turning the packed dirt into mud and creating small rivers that ran toward the barn. The cattle had taken shelter under a stand of cottonwoods near the creek, and she could barely make out their shapes through the downpour. I was planning to show you around the place today, Samuel said. Introduce you to the work that needs doing. But this rain, he shrugged. Might be we're stuck inside for a while. That's all right, Mary said. I'm sure there's plenty to do indoors. Samuel poured her a cup of coffee, and she wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, grateful for the heat. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the rain seemed to intensify. Actually, Samuel said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table, might be a good time to talk. About expectations. I mean, what the work entails. What you can expect from me. Mary took a seat across from him, studying his face in the lamplight. There was something different about him this morning. Not unfriendly, but more formal somehow, as if he'd spent the night thinking about the practicalities of their arrangement. I'm a fair employer, he began. I'll pay you $15 a month, plus room and board. That's more than most women make around here. But the work's harder than most. 2, this isn't town living out here. We all do what needs doing. Mary nodded. $15 was indeed generous, more than she'd made taking in mending and washing in Millfield. What kind of work? She asked. Cooking, mostly. I can manage bacon and beans, but I'm tired of eating like a bachelor. Mending, washing, general housekeeping. During busy times, roundup, calving season. You might need to help with the animals too. Nothing dangerous, he added quickly. But cattle work doesn't stop for convenience. I can do all that. Mary said, I grew up on a farm. Remember, I know my way around livestock. Samuel smiled. The first real smile she'd seen from him. Good, that'll make things easier. Thunder crashed overhead. Closer this time, and the rain hammered against the roof with renewed force. Mary flinched despite herself. Storms had always made her nervous, even as a child. You all right? Samuel asked. Just loud, she said, trying to keep her voice steady, as if summoned by her words. Lightning split the sky outside the window, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The lamp on the table flickered, and Mary's coffee cup rattled against the saucer. That was close, Samuel observed. Too close. Mary set down her cup with hands that weren't quite steady. Outside, the storm seemed to be settling in for a long stay, the rain driving against the windows with a violence that spoke of wind and fury. We should probably move away from the windows, Samuel said, rising from his chair. Lightning's been known to find its way indoors during storms like this. Mary followed him to the sitting area at the far end of the room, where a stone fireplace promised warmth and safety. Samuel knelt to build up the fire, and soon orange flames were dancing behind the grate, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Better, he said, settling into one of the chairs. Fire's not much help against lightning, but it makes the waiting easier. Mary took the chair across from him, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The warmth of the fire was welcome, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were very much alone out here, miles from any neighbor, with nothing but Samuel's protection between her and whatever the world might throw at them. Tell me about the ranch, she said, partly to distract herself from the storm, and partly because she genuinely wanted to know. How many cattle do you run? About 200 head, Samuel replied. Started with 50 when I first came out here. Been building the herd slow and steady ever since. Pride crept into his voice. Good breeding stock, mostly. I'm not trying to get rich quick. Just build something that'll last. That's smart, Mary said. My father always said the tortoise beats the hare in the end. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was. Mary smiled at the memory. Used to say that anyone could start something, but it took real character to see it through to the finish. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by thunder that seemed to go on forever. Mary gripped the arms of her chair, fighting the urge to cover her ears like a child. You really don't like storms, Samuel observed. Not particularly. Mary forced herself to relax her grip. When I was 7, lightning struck our barn, burned it to the ground with 3 horses inside. I can still remember the sound they made. She shuddered. I know it's foolish to be afraid of weather, but it's not foolish, Samuel interrupted gently. Fear keeps us alive sometimes, makes us careful. The rain continued its assault on the roof, and Mary found herself wondering what would happen if the storm damaged the house. If the roof leaked or the windows broke. In town, there would be neighbors to turn to, places to take shelter. Out here, there was only Samuel and whatever protection these walls could provide. Mary, Samuel said quietly. She looked at him. You're safe here, he said, echoing his words from the night before. Storm or no storm, you're safe. Something in his tone made her believe him. Not just the words, but the way he said them. Calm, certain, as if he'd made a promise to himself as much as to her. How can you be so sure? She asked. Samuel was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I've been through worse than weather, he said simply. Learned a few things about what a man can survive, what he can protect. He glanced at her. And what's worth protecting? The words hung between them like something fragile and precious. Mary felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. You don't really know me, she said, the same protest she'd made before. No more than you think, Samuel replied. Know you've been hurt. Know you've been judged unfairly. Know you're stronger than you think you are. How could you possibly know that? Because you're here, he said. Because when life knocked you down, you got back up and kept moving. Because when that horse trader tried to humiliate you today, you held your head high and spoke your truth. He leaned forward slightly. That takes strength. Mary, more than most people have. Thunder rolled overhead again, but somehow it seemed less frightening now. The fire crackled in the grate, and the warm circle of lamplight made the small house feel like a fortress against the storm. "What about you?" Mary asked. "What brought you out here? Really?" Samuel was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost beneath the sound of rain. "War changed things," he said. "Changed me. When I came home," he shook his head, "wasn't much left to come home to. Family scattered, farm sold for taxes, friends dead or gone west." He stared into the fire. "Figured I might as well start over somewhere new." "That must have been hard." "Hard's just another word for life," Samuel said with a slight smile. "But yes, it was hard. Still is. Sometimes." Mary thought about that, about starting over, about building something new from the ruins of what came before. It struck her that she and Samuel weren't so different after all. Both of them refugees from one kind of life, trying to build another. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Coming out here, living alone?" Samuel considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss having someone to talk to besides the horses and cattle. Miss having someone to share meals with. Share the work." He looked at her directly. "But regret? No. This place, this life, it's mine. I built it with my own hands, and nobody can take it away from me." Mary understood that feeling, the hunger for something that belonged to you completely. She'd never had that. Even the farm where she'd grown up had really belonged to her parents. And after they died, she'd learned how quickly security could be stripped away. Lightning flashed again, but the thunder seemed more distant now. The worst of the storm was moving on, leaving behind the steady drumming of rain that promised to continue for hours yet. "Looks like we're stuck inside for the day," Samuel said, settling back in his chair. "I don't mind," Mary replied, and realized she meant it. There was something peaceful about being trapped by weather, about having no choice but to sit still and let the world rage outside while they remained safe and warm within. "Tell me more about the work," she said. "What's a typical day like?" Samuel smiled. "Well, if this was a normal morning, I'd have been up before dawn checking on the cattle, making sure they weathered the night all right. Then breakfast, usually just coffee and whatever's handy. After that, it depends on the season. This time of year, it's mostly maintenance work, mending fence, checking the water sources, keeping an eye on the herd. And winter? Winter's harder. Feeding hay, breaking ice so the cattle can drink, watching for wolves." He paused. "Gets lonely in winter. Long nights, short days, sometimes snowed in for weeks at a time." Mary tried to imagine it, just the two of them, isolated by snow and cold, dependent on each other for companionship and survival. The thought should have frightened her, but instead she felt something that might have been anticipation. "I think I could handle that," she said. Samuel studied her face in the firelight. "I think you could too." The rain continued its steady rhythm, and the fire settled into glowing embers. Mary felt a drowsiness creeping over her. The combination of warmth and safety and the hypnotic sound of water against glass. "Mary," Samuel said softly. She looked at him through half-closed eyes. "Whatever happened to you before, whatever brought you to Millfield, it doesn't matter to me. You understand that?" Mary felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't say exactly why. "Why not?" "Because the past is done." Samuel said simply, "It's what happens from here that counts." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small house, Mary felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by her past, the possibility of being seen for who she was rather than who others assumed her to be. "Thank you," she whispered. Samuel nodded and rose to add another log to the fire, as the flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Mary closed her eyes and listened to the rain. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt truly safe. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming under a brilliant morning sun. Mary woke to the sound of birds singing and the distant lowing of cattle, the violent weather of yesterday seeming like something from a half-remembered dream. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Samuel already at work preparing breakfast. The coffee was strong and hot, and he'd managed to produce eggs and bacon from somewhere, along with biscuits that were only slightly burned around the edges. "Sleep well?" he asked, glancing up from the stove. "Better than I have in months," Mary admitted. And it was true. The bed had been comfortable, but more than that, she'd felt safe enough to truly rest for the first time since leaving Kansas. After breakfast, Samuel showed her around the ranch properly, the barn with its neat stalls and sweet-smelling hay, the chicken coop where a dozen hens scratched and pecked at the ground, the vegetable garden that would need tending as summer progressed. Everything spoke of careful planning and patient work, of a man building something to last. They were inspecting the fence line near the creek when the riders appeared. Mary saw them first. 3 men on horseback silhouetted against the morning sky, approaching at an easy lope. Samuel followed her gaze and straightened, his hand moving unconsciously to rest on the fence post. "Know them?" Mary asked. "2 of them," Samuel replied, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "The one in front is Charlie Patterson. Works for the Double Bar spread about 20 miles south. Good man, mostly." He paused. "The one on the left is his cousin, Ben. He's less good." As the riders drew closer, Mary could make out their faces. Charlie Patterson was a weathered man in his 40s with graying hair and kind eyes. Ben Patterson looked to be younger, with the restless energy of someone always looking for trouble. The third man she didn't recognize, tall and lean with a carefully groomed mustache and clothes that suggested he wasn't used to ranch work. "Morning, Sam," Charlie called out as they reined in near the fence. "Heard you were in town yesterday. Caused quite a stir, from what folks are saying." Samuel nodded politely. "Charlie, Ben." He looked at the third man with questioning eyes. "This here's William Carver," Charlie said. "He's new to the territory, looking to buy some land. Thought you might know of any spreads for sale." Carver touched his hat brim in greeting, his gaze sliding past Samuel to rest on Mary with obvious interest. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Reed. And this must be the lady who's caused such a sensation in Millfield." Mary felt heat creep up her neck, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't believe we've been introduced, Mr. Carver." "William Carver, at your service," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I understand you're working for Mr. Reed now." The way he said working made Mary's skin crawl, but before she could respond, Ben Patterson spoke up with a laugh. "That's one way to put it," he said. "Heard tell Jake Morrison was offering quite a package deal yesterday. Horse and rider together, if you catch my meaning." Samuel's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, but Mary caught the change. "Mary's my housekeeper," he said evenly. "She helps with the cooking and general maintenance." Ben's grin widened. "I'm sure she does. Must get mighty lonely out here." "Sam, can't blame a man for wanting some companionship." Mary felt her temper flare. She'd dealt with men like Ben Patterson before, men who thought they could say anything they pleased to a woman they considered beneath their notice. But before she could speak, Samuel moved. It wasn't dramatic or threatening. He simply stepped forward and placed himself between Mary and the mounted men, his body language shifting from casual to alert. "I think there might be some misunderstanding about Miss Whitfield's position here," Samuel said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made even Ben straighten in his saddle. Charlie Patterson shot his cousin a warning look. "Now, boys, no need for any unpleasantness. We just stopped by to be neighborly." But Ben wasn't ready to let it go. "Come now, Sam. We're all men here. No shame in buying yourself a little female company. Hell, might even improve your disposition." "That's enough," Samuel said. And this time there was no mistaking the warning in his voice. William Carver, perhaps sensing the tension, attempted to steer the conversation in a different direction. "Perhaps we could discuss those land parcels, Mr. Reed. I'm particularly interested in properties with water access." But Mary had heard enough. The familiar shame was rising in her throat, the weight of whispers and assumptions, and men who thought they could discuss her like she was livestock. She'd spent too many months letting others define her, letting their opinions shape how she saw herself. "Gentlemen," she said, stepping forward to stand beside Samuel, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." All eyes turned to her, and she felt that familiar flutter of panic. But Samuel was solid and steady beside her, and somehow that made the words easier to find. "Mr. Reed offered me honest work at honest wages," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I cook his meals, mend his clothes, and help maintain his household. Nothing more, nothing less." Ben Patterson's grin turned ugly. "Sure, sweetheart, and I'm the King of England." That's when Samuel extended his hand toward Mary. It was such a simple gesture. His palm turned upward, fingers relaxed. An invitation rather than a demand. But there was something in the way he did it, something deliberate and unmistakable, that made even the mounted men take notice. Mary looked down at his offered hand, understanding instinctively what he was asking. Not just for her to take his hand, but to trust him, to let him make a statement that would leave no room for misinterpretation. She placed her hand in his. Samuel's fingers closed around hers, warm and steady and sure. He didn't pull her closer or make any grand gestures. He simply held her hand as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as if she belonged exactly where she was. "Miss Whitfield is under my protection," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on Ben Patterson. "I'd appreciate it if you'd speak of her with respect." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken challenges. Ben's face flushed red, but Charlie was already gathering his reins, clearly eager to diffuse the situation. "Of course, Sam," Charlie said quickly. "No disrespect intended. We should probably be moving along anyway. Got a lot of ground to cover today." William Carver seemed torn between curiosity and caution. "Perhaps we could continue our discussion another time. Mr. Reed, about those land parcels." "Perhaps," Samuel replied noncommittally. As the three men prepared to ride away, Ben couldn't resist one parting shot. "You be careful out here, Sam. Sometimes a man can get so lonely he makes poor decisions." This time Samuel didn't respond with words. He simply stood there, Mary's hand still clasped in his, and watched them ride away. The message was clear enough. Whatever decisions he'd made, he was prepared to stand by them. After the riders disappeared over the ridge, Mary became acutely aware that Samuel was still holding her hand. His palm was calloused from rope and leather, warm and strong, and she could feel the steady pulse of his heartbeat where their wrists touched. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For..." She gestured vaguely in the direction the men had gone. "For defending me. For making it clear that I'm not, that we're not..." "We're not what?" Mary felt heat flood her cheeks. You know what they were thinking, what they assumed. Samuel was quiet for a moment, and Mary realized he still hadn't released her hand. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Let them think what they want," he said. "Their assumptions say more about them than about us. But people will talk. People always talk." Samuel turned to face her fully, and Mary found herself looking up into those steady gray eyes. "Question is, do you care what they say?" Mary considered this. A month ago, the answer would have been yes, desperately, painfully yes. The weight of public opinion had driven her from one town to another, had shaped every decision she'd made since her parents died. But standing here in the morning sunlight, her hand warm in Samuel's, she found that the old fears had lost some of their power. "I'm tired of caring," she said finally. Samuel smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since the confrontation began. "Good, that's a start." Only then did he release her hand, and Mary found herself missing the warmth immediately. But something had changed between them in that simple gesture. Some line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. "We should check the cattle," Samuel said, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Make sure yesterday's storm didn't cause any problems." As they walked toward the pasture, Mary found herself thinking about the way Samuel had offered his hand, not as a claim of ownership, but as a statement of partnership. He'd made it clear to the three men that she was under his protection, but he'd also made it clear that the choice to accept that protection was hers. The cattle were scattered across the pasture, peacefully grazing in the aftermath of the storm. A few looked up as Mary and Samuel approached, then went back to their business with the casual indifference of animals who knew they were safe. "They trust you," Mary observed. "Trust's earned," Samuel replied. "You treat something right, it learns to trust you. Treat it poorly." He shrugged. "Well, animals have long memories." Mary thought about that as they walked among the cattle, checking for injuries or signs of distress from the storm. Trust was indeed earned, and she was beginning to understand that Samuel Reed was the kind of man who earned it honestly, not through grand gestures or pretty words, but through consistency, reliability, and the simple act of doing what he said he would do. "Samuel," she said as they made their way back toward the house. "Yes?" "What you said to those men about me being under your protection, what does that mean exactly?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Means what it sounds like," he said finally. "Means anyone who wants to hurt you or insult you or treat you poorly will have to answer to me first." "And what do you expect in return?" "Nothing you're not willing to give." Samuel said simply, "I told you before, I never asked you to be anything other than what you are." They'd reached the house now, and Mary paused on the front porch, looking back across the land that Samuel had carved out of the wilderness through sheer determination and hard work. In the distance, she could see the dust cloud raised by the departing riders, already fading into the vast blue sky. "I've never had that before," she said quietly. "Someone willing to stand up for me." "You've got it now," Samuel replied, and the simple certainty in his voice made something tight in Mary's chest begin to loosen. As they went inside to prepare the midday meal, Mary found herself thinking about the feel of Samuel's hand holding hers. Strong, steady, sure. For the first time since her parents died, she began to believe that she might have found not just employment, but something far more precious, a place where she belonged. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Mary rose before dawn to start the coffee and prepare breakfast, while Samuel tended to the animals and checked the fence lines. They worked through the morning hours in comfortable companionship, he mending harness or fixing whatever the previous day's work had broken, she cleaning house and preparing meals that were far better than anything Samuel had managed on his own. The house itself seemed to welcome her presence. Windows that had been shuttered against the loneliness now stood open to let in light and air. Wildflowers appeared in mason jars on the kitchen table and windowsills. The spare functionality of a bachelor's dwelling gradually softened into something that felt like a home. Samuel had given her a small room off the kitchen for her personal use, and he was scrupulously respectful of her privacy. He knocked before entering any room where she might be working, never presumed to touch her belongings, and maintained a careful physical distance that somehow managed to be protective without feeling restrictive. But Mary found herself noticing things about him that she hadn't expected. The way he gentled his voice when speaking to the horses, how he always made sure she had the choice portion of meat at dinner, the fact that he'd taken to washing more carefully and combing his hair with obvious care each morning. 2 weeks into her employment, She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her hands stilled on the wet sheet she'd been pinning, and she felt that familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Samuel emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and Mary saw his posture straighten as he recognized the riders. There were 4 of them this time, led by a man she'd never seen before, tall and thick-set with graying hair and the kind of confident bearing that spoke of authority and money. "Samuel Reed," the man called out as they approached. "Been looking forward to meeting you properly. Name's Harrison Burke. I own the Triple Crown spread over east of Millfield." Mary had heard of Harrison Burke. Everyone in the territory had. He owned more land than any other rancher in 3 counties, had the biggest house, the finest horses, and a reputation for getting what he wanted regardless of what it cost others. "Mr. Burke," Samuel replied neutrally. "What brings you out this way?" Burke dismounted with the easy confidence of a man who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere. The 3 men with him remained mounted. Hired hands, by the look of them, though they carried themselves more like guards than cowboys. "Business, mostly," Burke said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But also curiosity. Been hearing interesting stories about your household arrangements." Mary felt heat creep up her neck, but she continued hanging the laundry with deliberate calm. She could feel Burke's attention like a weight pressing against her back. "I keep a housekeeper," Samuel said simply. "Nothing unusual in that." No, of course not," Burke agreed, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Though the circumstances of her employment have certainly provided entertainment for the folks in town." One of Burke's men snickered, and Mary's hands tightened on the clothespin she was holding. Samuel's voice, when he spoke, carried a warning that even Burke seemed to notice. "Miss Whitfield is a respectable woman doing respectable work." "Oh, I'm sure she is," Burke said smoothly. "Very respectable." He glanced toward Mary with obvious appraisal. "Though I have to say, Reed, you've got fine taste. Wouldn't mind having something that pretty brightening up my own place." Mary turned from the clothesline to face the men directly. Her chin lifted in defiance of the assumptions she could see written plainly on their faces. Burke's eyes moved over her with the calculating assessment of a man pricing livestock. "Miss," Burke said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. "Mary Whitfield, isn't it? I knew your parents. Rest their souls. Fine people. They'd be proud to see how well you've landed on your feet." The casual cruelty in his words hit Mary like a physical blow. He was implying things about her parents' memory, about her own character, with the smooth confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences for his opinions. "My parents raised me to work for what I needed," Mary said, her voice steadier than she felt. "They'd be proud that I chose honest labor over easier alternatives." Burke's smile widened. "Honest labor. Yes, I'm sure that's what you call it." He turned back to Samuel. "Which brings me to why I'm here. Reed, I've got a proposition for you." Samuel crossed his arms over his chest. "I'm listening." "I'm expanding my operation, looking to buy up some of the smaller spreads in the area, consolidate them into something more efficient." Burke gestured broadly at the ranch around them. "This is good land, Reed, well-watered, good grazing. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer. Ranch isn't for sale." "Now don't be hasty," Burke said, his tone becoming more persuasive. "You're working yourself to death out here, trying to make a go of it alone. What happens if you get hurt? Get sick? Who's going to run this place then? Your housekeeper?" The word dripped with insinuation, and Mary saw Samuel's jaw tighten. "I can take care of my own affairs," Samuel said. "I'm sure you can," Burke replied. "But why struggle when you don't have to? I'm talking about enough money to buy yourself a nice little place closer to town. Maybe find yourself a proper wife. Settle down comfortable-like." He glanced meaningfully at Mary. "Course, I understand a man has certain needs that need tending to while he's making up his mind about such things. Hell, if you're attached to your current arrangements, I might be willing to work something out. Keep the girl on as part of the deal, so to speak." The silence that followed was so complete that Mary could hear the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. Samuel stood perfectly still, but something in his posture reminded Mary of a rattlesnake coiled to strike. Mr. Burke," Samuel said quietly, "I think you've misunderstood the situation here." "Have I?" Burke's smile didn't waver. "From what I hear, you bought her right along with Morrison's horse. Package deal, wasn't it?" "What you heard," Samuel said, his voice growing colder. "And what actually happened are two different things entirely." Burke shrugged. "Maybe so, but you can't blame a man for being interested in such an unusual business arrangement." His eyes found Mary again. "Pretty thing like that, all alone in the world. No family to speak for her. Man could do worse for entertainment." That's when Mary stepped forward. She moved without conscious thought, her feet carrying her across the yard until she stood beside Samuel. The three mounted men shifted in their saddles, and Burke's eyebrows rose in surprise. Mr. Burke," Mary said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, "I think you labor under several misapprehensions." "Do I now?" Burke seemed amused by her directness. "You seem to think I'm some kind of commodity, to be bought and sold at a man's whim." Mary felt anger burning in her chest, clean and bright and liberating. "Let me clarify the situation for you." Burke's smile faltered slightly. "I work for Mr. Reed because he offered me fair wages for honest work," Mary continued. "Because he treats me with respect and decency. Because he's a good man who judges people by their character rather than their circumstances." "And I suppose you're going to tell me there's nothing irregular about your living arrangements?" Burke's tone suggested he found the idea laughable. "I'm going to tell you that my living arrangements are none of your concern," Mary replied sharply. "And that any man who can't tell the difference between a housekeeper and a something else says more about his own character than mine." Burke's face flushed red, but before he could respond, Samuel spoke. "You heard the lady," he said quietly. "I think it's time for you to leave." "Now hold on there, Reed," Burke began, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I came here to make you a legitimate business offer, and I declined it." Samuel interrupted. Politely, "Miss Whitfield also declined your interest in her situation." Also politely. He paused. "You'd be wise to accept those answers and move on." Burke looked around the yard as if seeing it properly for the first time. The neat buildings, the well-maintained fences, the signs of an operation run by someone who cared about details. His expression suggested he was reassessing both Samuel and the situation. "You're making a mistake, Reed," he said finally. "Land like this, it's wasted on small operations. And a woman like that," he shook his head. "Well, let's just say the frontier's no place for someone so delicate." "Miss Whitfield can take care of herself," Samuel replied. "And so can I." Burke remounted his horse with movements that spoke of barely controlled anger. "We'll see about that," he said. "Offer's still open if you change your mind, but it won't stay open forever." As the four men rode away, Mary found herself standing closer to Samuel than propriety probably dictated. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the familiar scents of leather and soap and honest work that seemed to cling to him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" For not treating me like I was actually for sale." The words came out more vulnerably than she'd intended. Samuel turned to look at her directly, and Mary saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Mary," he said softly, "you're not for sale. Not to Burke, not to anybody. You're here because you choose to be, for as long as you choose to be." "And if I choose to stay?" The question hung between them like something fragile and precious. Samuel's eyes searched her face, and Mary felt as if he was seeing straight through to her heart. "Then you stay," he said simply, "for as long as you want." Mary nodded, not trusting her voice. In the distance, she could see the dust cloud raised by Burke's departing party, already fading into the vast blue sky. But here, standing in the yard of the ranch that was becoming home, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents died, the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "Samuel," she said quietly. "Yes?" "What Burke said about the frontier being no place for someone delicate." "You're not delicate," Samuel interrupted, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." Mary felt tears prick her eyes, though whether they were from gratitude or relief or something else entirely, she couldn't say. All she knew was that for the first time in years, someone saw her as she truly was rather than as others assumed her to be. As they walked back toward the house together, Mary realized that what had started as simple employment had become something far more complex and precious. She wasn't just Samuel's housekeeper. She was his partner in building something worth keeping. And for the first time since leaving Kansas, she allowed herself to hope that she might be worth keeping too. 3 weeks passed in peaceful routine after Burke's visit. Mary had begun to believe that perhaps the worst was behind her, that she'd finally found a place where her past couldn't reach her. The work was satisfying, the companionship easy, and slowly, carefully, she was beginning to trust that this new life might actually last. She was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard the horse approaching. The sound made her pause, knife halfway through slicing an onion, because there was something urgent about the hoofbeats. Not the easy lope of a neighbor paying a social call, but the hard gallop of someone with purpose. Samuel must have heard it too, because she could see him through the window, emerging from the barn with that alert posture she'd come to recognize. The rider came into view, a young man on a lathered horse, pulling up hard in front of the house. Mary wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, squinting against the late afternoon sun. The rider was Tommy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's youngest boy from the boarding house in Millfield. His face was flushed with heat and exertion, and he was breathing hard. "Mr. Reed," Tommy called out, sliding down from his horse. "Got a message for you from town, from the sheriff." Samuel approached with measured steps, but Mary caught the tension in his shoulders. "What's the trouble, Tommy?" The boy glanced nervously between Samuel and Mary before speaking. "It's about Thomas Hartwell. Sir, he's been asking questions about Miss Whitfield here. Sheriff Johnson thought you ought to know." Mary felt the blood drain from her face. The onion knife slipped from her fingers, clattering to the porch floor. Thomas Hartwell, the name she'd hoped never to hear again. The man whose lies had driven her from Kansas in the first place. "What kind of questions?" Samuel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Tommy shifted uncomfortably. "Well, sir, he rode into town yesterday, asking where he might find Mary Whitfield. Said he had business with her. Sheriff Johnson told him he didn't know nothing about any Mary Whitfield, but—" The boy's voice trailed off. "But what?" Samuel pressed. "But Mr. Morrison was in the saloon. Sir, he told Hartwell all about how you'd bought her along with his horse. Made it sound like—" Tommy glanced apologetically at Mary. "Well, like she was working for you in a way that ain't exactly proper." Mary sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly unsteady. She'd known this day might come, had lived with the fear of it for months, but somehow she'd begun to hope that distance and time might have been enough to keep her safe. "Where is he now?" Samuel asked. "Still in town, far as I know. Sheriff Johnson says he's been drinking heavy and asking more questions. Seems real determined to find her." Tommy paused. "There's more, sir." Samuel waited. "He's been telling folks that Miss Whitfield here owes him money. Says she ran off with something that belonged to him, and he's come to collect." Tommy's young face was troubled. "Sheriff Johnson don't believe it, but some folks in town, well, they're willing to listen to any story that confirms what they already think they know." Mary closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of shame and fear settling over her like a shroud. Of course Thomas would tell such a story. It fit perfectly with the reputation he'd already given her. A woman of loose morals who would naturally resort to theft when her other schemes failed. "Thank you for bringing word, Tommy," Samuel said quietly. "You'd better get that horse watered and head back before dark." After the boy had tended to his horse and ridden away, Samuel sat down beside Mary on the porch steps. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken questions and unwelcome truths. "Tell me about Thomas Hartwell," Samuel said finally. Mary kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills. "I told you about him before. He said he'd help me keep my parents' farm after they died." "In exchange for what?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Mary felt heat creep up her neck, the familiar burn of shame and humiliation. "He wanted companionship," she said quietly. "Said a man like him, with connections and influence, could help a girl like me, but that help would come with expectations." Samuel was quiet, waiting for her to continue. "When I refused, he made sure the bank foreclosed anyway. Then he spread stories about me. Said I'd been willing at first, but had tried to take advantage of his kindness. Said I was a scheming woman who'd used her feminine wiles to try to get something for nothing." Mary's voice grew bitter. Amazing how quickly people believed him. A respectable businessman's word against that of a desperate young woman. "And now he's here." "Now he's here," Mary agreed. "And he's telling new lies to support the old ones." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Mary found herself afraid to look at him. Now that Thomas was here, spreading his poison. How long before Samuel began to doubt her story? How long before he started wondering if maybe there was some truth to the rumors after all? "Mary," Samuel said softly. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Did you take anything from him? Money or property or anything else?" The question was asked gently, without accusation, but it still stung. "No," Mary said firmly. "I never took anything that wasn't freely given. Never asked for anything except the help he'd promised." Samuel nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "Then we don't have a problem." "Don't we?" Mary's voice was sharper than she'd intended. "He's in town right now, telling anyone who'll listen that I'm a thief as well as everything else. How long before people start believing him? How long before they decide you must be harboring a criminal?" "Let them think what they want," Samuel said, echoing his words from weeks before. "Their opinions don't change the truth." "The truth doesn't matter if no one believes it," Mary replied. "Thomas is a smooth talker, a man with money and influence. She gestured helplessly at herself. "You're just what?" "I'm just a woman with a reputation. A woman alone with no family to vouch for her character." Mary felt tears threatening and blinked them back angrily. "People want to believe the worst about women like me. It makes them feel better about their own choices." Samuel studied her face in the fading light. "You're afraid?" It wasn't a question, and Mary didn't try to deny it. "Terrified," she admitted. "Thomas isn't the kind of man who gives up easily. He's here for a reason, and it's not just about money or property. It's about control." "Control how?" Mary hesitated, trying to find words for something she'd only half understood herself back in Kansas. "Thomas Hartwell is a man who's used to getting what he wants. When I refused him, it wasn't just rejection, it was defiance. He couldn't let that stand. He had to find a way to put me back in what he considered my proper place." Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And what place is that?" "Beneath him, dependent on his mercy." Mary's voice grew quiet. "He doesn't want me, Samuel, not really. He wants to break me, to prove that he can." The sun had disappeared behind the hills now, leaving them sitting in the gathering dusk. From somewhere in the distance came the lonely call of a coyote, answered by another, then another, until the prairie seemed to echo with their wild voices. "He won't touch you," Samuel said quietly. Mary looked at him sharply. You can't know that. I can promise it. Samuel, you don't understand. Thomas has money, influence, connections. He can make trouble for you, for the ranch, if he tells the right people the right stories. Mary shook her head. I won't let you risk everything you've built for me. Samuel turned to face her fully, and even in the dim light she could see the determination in his expression. Mary, listen to me. I built this place with my own hands. I've fought drought and flood and winter storms to keep it running. I've faced down claim jumpers and rustlers and every other kind of trouble the frontier can throw at a man. His voice was quiet, but absolutely certain. Thomas Hartwell doesn't scare me. Maybe he should, Mary whispered. Samuel reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and strong and steady. You came here looking for honest work and a fair chance. I gave you both. That doesn't change just because some man from your past has decided to make trouble. Mary felt tears spill over despite her efforts to contain them. You barely know me. Why would you risk so much for someone like me? Someone like you. Samuel's voice held a note of gentle reproach. You mean someone who's worked harder than anyone should have to just to survive? Someone who's faced down gossip and judgment and kept going anyway? Someone who speaks the truth even when it costs her? Mary stared at him through her tears, unable to speak. I know exactly who you are. Mary Whitfield. Samuel continued. You're the woman who stands up to men like Harrison Burke when they try to diminish her. You're the woman who chose honest work over easier alternatives, even when those alternatives would have solved all your problems. You're the strongest person I've ever met, and I'll be damned if I let Thomas Hartwell or anyone else convince you otherwise. A sound from the darkness made them both freeze, the soft jingle of harness, the muffled thud of hoofbeats on grass. Someone was approaching, trying to move quietly through the night. Samuel was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle he kept by the door. Get inside, he said quietly to Mary. Lock the door and stay away from the windows. But Mary had already seen the rider emerging from the shadows near the barn. Even in the dim starlight, she recognized the tall figure and confident bearing. It's too late, she whispered. He's here. Thomas Hartwell rode into the yard as if he owned it, his expensive horse stepping delicately through the darkness. He was exactly as Mary remembered, tall, well-dressed, handsome in a way that made people trust him before they knew better. His smile gleamed white in the starlight as he dismounted. Well, well, Thomas called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Mary Whitfield, you've led me quite a chase, my dear. Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Mary and the approaching man. Mr. Hartwell, I presume, you're trespassing on private property. Thomas laughed, a sound without warmth. Trespassing? I don't think so. I'm here to collect what belongs to me. His eyes found Mary in the shadows of the porch. Hello, Mary. Did you miss me? Mary felt her knees threaten to buckle, but she forced herself to stand straight. She'd run from this man once. She wouldn't run again. What do you want, Thomas? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. What I've always wanted, Thomas replied, his tone becoming silky and dangerous. What you owe me. She doesn't owe you anything, Samuel said flatly. Thomas's attention shifted to Samuel, and Mary saw him taking the other man's measure, noting the work-hardened frame, the steady posture, the rifle held with casual competence. And you are? Thomas asked. Samuel Reed, this is my land, and Miss Whitfield is under my protection. Protection? Thomas's laugh was genuinely amused this time. Oh, my dear fellow, I think you've misunderstood the situation entirely. Mary here isn't the innocent farm girl she's pretended to be. She's a thief and a liar, and she's about to come with me to face the consequences of her actions. No, Samuel said simply. She's not. Thomas's smile faded, and for the first time, Mary saw uncertainty flicker across his features. He'd expected to find her alone, vulnerable, easy to intimidate. He hadn't counted on Samuel Reed. "We'll see about that," Thomas said softly. "We'll just see about that." The confrontation with Thomas Hartwell ended not with violence, but with Sheriff Johnson's timely arrival and Thomas's discovery that his lies wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. Samuel's quiet determination and the sheriff's questions had been enough to send Thomas back to Kansas, but not before he'd spat threats and promises that this wasn't over. That had been 2 months ago. Now, as autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and rust, Mary found herself sitting on the front porch in the gentle warmth of an October afternoon, watching Samuel repair a section of fence near the creek. The leaves on the cottonwoods rustled in the breeze, and the air carried the sweet scent of ripening grass and the distant smoke from neighbors burning off their fields. The threat of Thomas Hartwell had faded like a bad dream, leaving behind something stronger and more solid than Mary had dared to hope for. The confrontation had changed things between her and Samuel in ways she was still learning to understand, not in dramatic gestures or passionate declarations, but in the quiet certainty that they belonged together, that what they'd built was worth protecting. She mended one of Samuel's shirts as she watched him work, her needle moving in steady rhythm through the torn fabric. He'd caught it on a piece of barbed wire yesterday while checking the cattle, and she'd scolded him for his carelessness with the gentle authority of someone who had the right to worry about such things. The work had become second nature now, cooking meals that pleased them both, keeping the house clean and comfortable, tending the garden that would help feed them through the winter. But somewhere along the way, it had stopped feeling like employment and started feeling like partnership, like home. Samuel looked up from his work and caught her watching him. Even at this distance, she could see his smile, and she felt that familiar flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the growing certainty that she was falling in love with this quiet, steady man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. He gathered his tools and began walking back toward the house, his easy stride covering the distance with the measured pace of a man who'd learned that most things worth doing couldn't be rushed. Mary set aside her mending and went inside to start supper, humming softly as she worked. They ate by lamplight, the conversation flowing as easily as it always did now. Talk of the cattle, plans for winter, small observations about the changing season. Samuel mentioned that Charlie Patterson had stopped by while she was in town getting supplies, that his wife was expecting their 4th child come spring. "Charlie asked if we'd stand as godparents," Samuel said, cutting into his beef with careful precision. "I told him I'd ask you." Mary looked up from her plate, struck by the casual way he'd said "we" and "us," as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as if they were truly a family unit that neighbors would think to ask such things of. "I'd be honored," she said quietly. Samuel nodded, satisfaction flickering across his features. "I thought you might say that. Charlie's a good man, and his wife's got sense. Their children could do worse than having you as a godmother." The words warmed Mary more than she could say. To be thought worthy of such trust, such responsibility. It was more than she'd dared to hope for when she'd stood beside Morrison's wagon in Millfield's dusty street. After supper, they moved to the sitting area as had become their custom. Samuel read from a newspaper that was only 2 weeks old, practically fresh news by frontier standards, while Mary worked on a quilt she'd been piecing together from fabric scraps. The pattern was simple but elegant, and she'd chosen colors that would complement the house's simple furnishings. "Says here they're talking about bringing the railroad through Millfield," Samuel said, looking up from the paper. "Connect it to the main line up north." "That would change things," Mary observed, not looking up from her stitching. "It would. More people, more businesses, more opportunities, I suppose." Samuel folded the paper and set it aside. "Question is whether that's good or bad for folks like us." Mary considered this as she worked. The railroad would bring civilization, law and order, social structures that might be more forgiving of her past than the rough frontier justice she'd been subjected to. But it would also bring people who might know Thomas Hartwell, who might have heard his version of events. "Are you worried?" Samuel asked, as if he'd read her thoughts. Should I be? Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the lamplight. Mary, I want you to know something. She set down her needle and gave him her full attention. What we have here, this life we've built, it's not dependent on other people's opinions or approval. His voice was serious, thoughtful. It's not dependent on the railroad coming or not coming, or on who moves to the territory, or what stories they might bring with them. What is it dependent on? Mary asked softly. On us, on what we choose. What we decide matters. Samuel paused. On whether we're brave enough to trust what we've found here. The words hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she dared to cross. Mary looked at this man who'd given her safety, respect, companionship, who'd stood between her and Thomas Hartwell's threats without a moment's hesitation, who looked at her now with something in his eyes that made her heart race with possibility. Samuel, she said quietly, are we talking about the railroad? A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. What do you think we're talking about? Mary set her quilting aside and looked directly at him. I think we're talking about whether I'm brave enough to believe that this, she gestured at the warm room, at the life they'd created together, is real. Whether I'm brave enough to stop waiting for it to be taken away. And are you? Mary thought about the past months, the gradual easing of constant vigilance, the slow growth of trust, the way Samuel had never once made her feel like she owed him anything more than honest work and fair dealing, the way he defended her, not because he owned her, but because he valued her. I'm getting there, she said honestly. Samuel nodded as if he'd expected that answer. That's enough for now. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. Mary picked up her quilting again, but found herself watching Samuel more than working. There was something different about him tonight. Not restless exactly, but as if he were gathering himself for something. Mary, he said finally. Yes? There's something I need to tell you. Samuel leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. About why I really offered you work that day in town. Mary felt a flutter of anxiety. You said you needed help with the house. I do, but that wasn't the real reason. Samuel met her eyes steadily. The real reason was that you reminded me of someone. Who? Me. Samuel's voice was quiet. 5 years ago, when I first came to this territory, I was running from something too. From judgments and assumptions and people who thought they knew my story better than I did. Mary set down her needle again, giving him her complete attention. I told you I came west after the war. Samuel continued. What I didn't tell you was why I had to leave. There was a woman, my commanding officer's wife. She took a liking to me that wasn't appropriate or welcome. Mary felt her heart clench with understanding. When I refused her advances, she claimed I'd forced myself on her, said I'd taken advantage of her husband's absence. Samuel's voice grew bitter. Amazing how quickly people believed her. A respectable officer's wife's word against that of a common soldier. What happened? Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison time. Samuel stared into the fire. When I got out, I found that the story had followed me home. Couldn't find work, couldn't rent a room. Everyone knew the tale of Samuel Reed, the soldier who'd betrayed his officer's trust. Mary reached out without thinking and placed her hand over his. So you came west? So I came west, Samuel agreed. Found a place where nobody knew the story yet. Built a life where what mattered was what I did, not what people said I'd done. And when you saw me in Millfield, I saw someone who understood what it was like to carry other people's assumptions. Someone who'd been judged for things that weren't anybody's business but her own. Samuel turned his hand palm up, capturing her fingers. I saw someone who deserved a fair chance. Mary felt tears prick her eyes. And now? Samuel's thumb traced across her knuckles, and Mary felt warmth spread up her arm at the gentle contact. Now I see someone who's become the best part of my life, he said simply. Someone I can't imagine living without. The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they were so unexpected, so generous, so completely without conditions or expectations. "Samuel," she whispered. "I know you've been hurt," he continued. "I know you have reasons not to trust, not to believe in promises, but Mary—" He lifted their joined hands and pressed her palm against his chest, where she could feel the steady beating of his heart. "I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't about loneliness or convenience or anything else except you, exactly as you are." Mary stared at him through her tears. This man who'd seen her at her most vulnerable and had chosen to offer protection instead of exploitation, who'd given her work when she needed employment and friendship when she needed acceptance, who'd stood between her and Thomas Hartwell's threats without asking for anything in return. "You know what I was before," she said, testing the waters one more time. "I know what people said you were," Samuel corrected gently. "I also know what I've seen with my own eyes these past months. I know you're honest and hardworking and brave. I know you make me laugh and think and hope for things I'd given up on. I know that when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is sharing coffee with you on the front porch." Mary felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, something that had been held in a clenched fist for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. "I'm not perfect," she whispered. "I never asked you to be," Samuel replied, echoing the words that had first given her hope all those months ago in the storm. "I never asked you to be anything other than exactly who you are." Mary looked at this man who'd given her everything: safety, respect, companionship, and now love, without ever asking her to be anything other than herself, who saw her clearly and completely and still thought she was worth keeping. "Samuel," she said softly. "Yes?" "I love you too." The words came easier than she'd expected, true and clean and without reservation. Samuel's face lit up with a smile that made him look years younger, and when he leaned forward to kiss her, Mary met him halfway. The kiss was gentle, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Mary had no desire to retreat. Instead, she moved closer, her free hand coming up to cup his cheek, marveling at the scratch of whiskers against her palm and the way he trembled slightly at her touch. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Samuel rested his forehead against hers, and Mary could see the happiness shining in his eyes. "Will you marry me?" he asked softly. "Not because you owe me anything or because you need protection, but because you want to build a life with me?" Mary thought about the quilt she'd been working on, how it had started as just scraps of fabric but had slowly become something beautiful and useful and whole, how the pattern only became clear when you stepped back and saw all the pieces working together. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like coming home. "Yes, I'll marry you." Samuel kissed her again, longer this time, with the confidence of a man who'd been given permission to love and be loved in return. When they finally separated, Mary curled against his side with the natural ease of someone who finally knew where she belonged. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves, and in the distance, a coyote called to the night. But inside the warm circle of lamplight, Mary Whitfield, soon to be Mary Reed, felt something she'd thought she'd lost forever: the deep, settled peace of being completely and unconditionally accepted for exactly who she was.